This lesson teaches RYA Coastal Skipper and Yachtmaster students everything they need to know about passage planning. Whenever you put to sea, you should have a passage plan. Obviously, the amount of time you give it, if all you are planning is a few hours' sail in familiar waters, will be substantially less than if you are embarking on a long offshore passage. But even so, you must always consider the basics of weather, tides, your vessel's suitability and preparedness, your crew's experience and physical abilities, and navigational hazards. You also need a contingency plan if things don't work out for whatever reason, and you must always leave word with someone ashore about your plan and what to do if you don't report in on schedule. Since 2002, it's actually been a legal requirement under something called SOLAS 5 to make a passage plan whenever you sail outside what are termed categorized waters, by which is meant outside harbours, estuaries and rivers. Actually, the regulations don't mandate a written passage plan, but the further you venture out to sea, the more likely it is that, in the event of a mishap, the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency will ask to see your plan. So if you are purely a leisure sailor, it's pretty much up to you whether you write it down. For example, if you are making a straightforward passage between neighbouring ports, especially if you've made the trip many times before, then nobody would expect you to construct a written plan. At the other end of the scale, if you are a professional skipper taking paying customers across the English Channel, you'd be foolish not to write down at least the basics. For commercial vessels, SOLAS 5 lays out 4 key stages of passage planning: appraisal, planning, execution, and monitoring. Key elements of the appraisal are suitability of the vessel, particularly its material state, limitations imposed by draft, air draft, stability, and range; crew numbers and ability; appropriate charts and publications including tide tables, tidal stream atlas, almanacs and pilot books, charts small and large scale, navigational instruments. The planning phase considers identifying the intended route, identifying dangers, restrictions such as harbour control, prohibited or precautionary areas, MARPOL consideration, crew ability, knowledge and experience, speed limits, expected depth of water and tidal heights with regard to clearance under keel, the method and frequency of position fixing, including primary and secondary options, together with an indication of areas where accuracy of position is critical, and contingency plans. Prior to executing the plan, the following should be updated with any changes: condition of the vessel's navigation equipment, review ETAs at critical points for tidal heights and streams, latest weather forecast, clarify daytime versus nighttime passing of danger points and any effect this may have on position fixing accuracy, and traffic conditions, especially at navigational focal points. Finally, the progress of the vessel and the crew, in accordance with the plan, should be closely and continuously monitored to ensure early indication of a need to modify the plan. You can print a copy of this and the last 3 slides from the Resources tab. All that said, there is no set format or layout for a passage plan, but a checklist or pro forma is very helpful, and there's one available at the Resources tab. Your instructor likes to combine this with a sketch chart, not dissimilar to the one we looked at in the lesson on pilotage. It can show the planned track and waypoints, hazards, tidal gates, lights, and ports of refuge. We'll construct this one step by step later in the lesson. Let's focus on the boat and its crew first. There's no simple answer to the question, is our boat suitable for the passage? Well-found vessels have come to grief close to their home port, and, at the other end of the spectrum, somewhat deranged individuals have crossed oceans in little more than a bathtub. However, common sense should prevail, and the European Recreational Craft Directive, RCD, is not a bad starting point. It categorizes all vessels as A. Ocean, B. Offshore, C. Inshore, and D. Inland or sheltered coastal waters. However, it only came into effect in 1988, so if your vessel was built before then, it doesn't help. Aside from a vessel's basic design construction, her seaworthiness is a function of how well she has been maintained and equipped. Assuming that your vessel is appropriate for the passage, there's a load of things to check before you set off, and a checklist can be a valuable component of your passage plan. Here are some ideas. You can probably think of some more. Are you carrying sufficient fuel in order to motor to a safe haven in the event that you are becalmed or you have a problem with your rig? Has your engine been serviced according to the manufacturer's schedule, and have you performed your daily checks on its cooling system, oil levels, filters, alternator belts, and for any leaks? Are your batteries in good condition, and is the alternator charging them properly? Have you got all the necessary spares? Fuel, oil, alternator belt, hose repair tape, Jubilee clips, impeller, fuses and tools for the engine, rope, shackles, a spare winch handle, duct tape, etc. for the boat? Have you performed a radio check? Are your standing and running rigging and sails in good condition? When was the last time you went up the mast to check your rig? What about the anchor, windlass and chain? Are all your navigation lights working? Are your skin fittings in good condition? Can you open and shut all your seacocks? Have you got softwood plugs located next to every seacock in case one breaks off at sea? Have you filled your freshwater tanks? Are you carrying adequate food for the voyage? Is there sufficient gas? Are the heads working properly? Is all the necessary safety equipment on board? Life raft, life jackets, harnesses, flares, life buoy, heaving line, man overboard recovery system, first aid kit, fire extinguishers and blanket, cable cutters, radar reflector, searchlight, foghorn, bilge pump and storm sails? We'll discuss this more in the lesson on safety. Are all the necessary charts and other publications, such as an up-to-date almanac, tide atlas, and pilot books, on board? What about a hand-bearing compass and binoculars? Is your GPS working? Have you swung your compass recently? Are your log and depth sounder working? Have they been calibrated and adjusted? Let's consider fuel consumption. Obviously, it's more of an issue for motor vessels than sailing vessels, but even they need to ensure that they carry sufficient fuel to navigate in and out of harbour, motor or motor sail in light winds, particularly headwinds, and to keep their batteries charged. We're only going to consider diesel engines because this course is aimed at skippers or nascent skippers of sailing yachts, motor yachts, fishing vessels, etc., and these will invariably have diesel engines. You should know the capacity of your fuel tanks, and it's not a good idea to run them below 20%, because if the vessel is heeled or the fuel sloshing around, the fuel outlet might come above the surface of the fuel, allowing air into the fuel pipe, and your engine will stop, possibly requiring bleeding before it will restart. Beware of fuel gauges. Many fuel tanks are irregularly shaped in order to fit efficiently into the bilge, whereas off-the-shelf float gauges assume that the surface of the fuel will fall in ratio to the tank's capacity. For example, this might mean that when the gauge shows half full, you actually have less than a third of a tank left. There are more sophisticated gauges that can be calibrated, but you'll need to check that yours has been. And, of course, in a heeled sailing vessel, the surface of the diesel won't be horizontal anyway. By the way, a great solution to accurately monitoring fuel usage is to pump fuel from your main tanks into a day tank, which can even be equipped with a simple sight gauge. If it's high enough above your engine, it also makes the system self-bleeding, although you will still need to loosen the bleed screw on the injector pump, and, even more importantly, it will keep your engine running if the feed pump fails. Ideally, all vessels would be fitted with at least 2 independent diesel tanks, each with its own fuel line and primary fuel filter. But whilst this is pretty common on motor yachts, it's unusual on all but quite large sailing yachts. So if you are on a vessel with only one tank, it's worth carrying at least 1 jerrycan of diesel just in case you misjudge your fuel consumption, or the fuel tank ruptures and you lose the lot into the bilge. You're going to need a big funnel too, if you expect to put it into your main tank at sea. At sea, we measure fuel consumption in litres or even tonnes per hour. We'll stick with litres, but of course the principles are the same with larger units of measure. For now, I'm only going to consider displacement vessels, in other words those that don't plane on the surface of the sea, like fast motor yachts, which we'll come to in a moment. A well-maintained diesel engine will burn about 2.2 litres per hour per 10 horsepower at full power. So, for example, an engine developing 100 horsepower will burn 22 litres an hour. Power in horsepower is approximately proportional to the cube of the shaft speed. So, for example, a 100 horsepower diesel engine capable of a maximum of 3000 rpm, running at 2400 rpm, 80% of maximum, will develop just over 51 horsepower, consuming approximately 11 litres per hour. The next part of the equation is, of course, what speed you will make at such and such revs. For displacement vessels, maximum hull speed in knots is given by the square root of her waterline in feet multiplied by 1.34. So, for example, a 50-foot vessel will have a maximum hull speed of approximately 9.5 knots. Hang on a moment, though. I can hear some of you saying that you've exceeded this by some considerable margin. So have I, on many occasions. I think my best in a 30-foot yacht with a waterline length of 26 feet is around 13 knots against a theoretical maximum of 6.8. But that was surfing downwind in big waves. The formula holds good, though, in flat water. As you approach hull speed, the amount of power required to achieve a small increase in speed shoots up. So it's very inefficient to motor at anything like maximum hull speed. Efficient cruising speed, as a percentage of hull speed, varies from vessel to vessel, but is likely to be in the range of 70 to 80%. So, for example, around 7.5 knots for a 50-foot vessel. So if you motor at efficient cruising speed, and seeing how many revs you're doing, you can work out your fuel consumption in miles per litre. Going back to our previous calculation, where we found that our 100 HP engine was consuming just over 11 litres per hour at 2400 rpm, if that were giving us 7.5 knots, then we'd be using 1.5 litres per mile. Obviously, different designs have different fuel tank capacities, but you might expect a typical modern 50-foot sailing yacht to have a 400-litre tank, giving a range of around 270 miles. Which is why it isn't unusual to see sailing yachts bound on ocean crossings with many jerrycans lashed on deck. Incidentally, if you're in a sailing vessel, it's nearly always highly advantageous to motor sail, if you can. Doing so might reduce fuel consumption by up to 50%. So much for displacement vessels. Now we'll consider planing motor yachts. Again, I'm going to stick to diesel engines because unless you're insane or hell-bent on winning an offshore powerboat race, anything but small petrol-engined motor vessels are not only mind-numbingly expensive to run, but also quite dangerous. Unfortunately, the formula we used earlier goes out the window, because there are more variables, and it is often more efficient to keep the speed well over the power hump that occurs in the transition from displacement to planing mode. You need data from the vessel's designer and to take account of her cruising displacement. Full diesel and water tanks, a jet ski on the stern, and a full wine cellar have a big impact. To give you some idea, this 60-foot motor yacht displacing 34 tons and equipped with twin 700 horsepower engines actually displaces 37 tons with 3/4 of a tank of fuel on board. With the throttles wide open at 2,350 rpm, she'll do 31.5 knots and burn 528 litres per hour, giving a range of 236 miles. If you throttle back to 1,750 rpm, you'll make 20 knots and extend her range to 288 miles. If you stick to her maximum displacement hull speed, making 10.3 knots at 1,200 rpm, you'll manage 773 miles. Professional yacht crew take note. This is how you're going to spend your time at sea when the owner isn't on board. Incidentally, at 2017 UK prices, and assuming that you sign a declaration stating that you use 40% of your diesel for heating, then at full throttle, this beast is going to burn over £500 worth of fuel an hour. Or, to put it another way, a trip from Cowes to Studland Bay, near Poole, for lunch is going to cost £1,000. I guess we need to consider water, too. Of course, if you're on a large cruising vessel with big water tanks and possibly a water maker, providing you don't all expect to take long showers in the morning, after every swim, and before you tuck up for the night, it's not going to be much of a problem. However, particularly on longer voyages, it's not unknown for water tanks to rupture or get contaminated. Water makers are also notoriously unreliable, need careful routine maintenance, and consume a lot of power. So all vessels should carry an emergency ration of water, stowed completely separate from the main water tanks. These days, the best way is to carry bottles of still mineral water. Resist the temptation to choose sparkling, as it makes unspeakably bad tea. If space is at a premium, split the multipacks into individual bottles, and they'll stuff into all sorts of nooks and crannies. 2 litres per person per day should be enough for drinking and cooking, but not washing up, or, of course, personal hygiene, which can be done in seawater with the right detergent and soaps. So if you're off on a 10-day offshore voyage without convenient stop-offs, with a crew of 6, then you need 10 times 6 times 2 equals 120 litres of bottled water. So much for fuel and water. You can work out what food you're going to need for yourselves. What else? Are you carrying all the necessary paperwork? If you're going foreign, you'll need the vessel's registration document. If you're going outside the EC, you'll need to comply with customs procedures, which we'll cover later, and ideally carry the vessel's original VAT invoice. Each country has its own regulations, and it's a complex area. Check with your almanac and RYA website regarding boating abroad. There's a link at the Resources tab. You must also carry your ship's radio license, and should carry a copy of your insurance certificate and current life raft service certificate. Obviously, you and your crew also need their passports if you're going foreign. Remember that you might need visas, and sometimes different rules apply to visitors arriving by sea to those arriving by air. If you're based in the UK, it's also worth registering your vessel in the Coast Guard CG66 scheme, which you can do online, and there's a link from the Resources tab. It's a one-off task, except that you need to remember to update it if your vessel's details change. It provides Coast Guard Marine Rescue Coordinators with full details of your vessel and will enable them to react quickly and appropriately in the event that you have a problem on passage. You then need to consider your crew, and that includes you. Are you and your crew sufficiently experienced and physically capable of making the passage safely? That's not to say that you shouldn't push your boundaries. After all, everybody has to make their first coastal passage, channel or ocean crossing. Just take it a step at a time. Assuming that you've got the requisite experience and stamina, who's your number two? Are they properly briefed and capable of taking charge if you're incapacitated for any reason? Do you or any of the crew suffer from seasickness such that it prevents them from taking full part in crewing the vessel? If anyone is unsure, take seasickness tablets before setting off. Does anyone suffer any medical problems that might place them in jeopardy during the voyage? Diabetes, asthma, heart problems, nut allergies? If they are reliant on medicines, have they brought them with them? Do you know where they're stowed, and how to help administer them if necessary? Is anyone color-blind? If anyone needs glasses or contact lenses, have they brought spares? Are all crew members equipped with suitable clothing? Have they brought sleeping bags if you're going to be away overnight? If you're going foreign, have they brought their passports? You also need to brief the crew. Do they know what to expect? How long will the passage take? What's the weather forecast? And, especially, how rough or cold might it be? What's each individual crew member's role? If you are sailing overnight, what's the watch system? Do they know under what circumstances they should call you if you're having a nap? If any of them have not sailed on this boat before, take time to walk them around the boat, showing them where everything is. Explain exactly how the heads and cooker work. Talk about conserving electrical power and fresh water. Tell them what the rules are for wearing life jackets and harnesses. Show them where all the safety equipment is stored, how to make a distress call on the VHF, and how to start the engine. Discuss and ideally practice a man overboard emergency, fire and gas drills. Make a record of each crew member's next of kin with their address and phone number. So, let's imagine a passage from Lymington in the Western Solent to Plymouth, a distance of around 114 miles. Actually, you'd split this into 3 parts: pilotage out of the Solent, perhaps to Needles Fairway Buoy, the passage itself, and pilotage into Plymouth, maybe from a waypoint which we'll call Plymouth Approaches, 3 miles south-southeast of the harbour entrance. This means that we can concentrate on just the middle, offshore, passage in this lesson. Here's where you need to consult your charts, small scale for an overview, larger scale for rounding headlands, etc., passage information in the almanac, and a tidal atlas. You can see that we're going to pass 3 major headlands: St. Albans Head, Portland Bill, and Start Point. Now's the time to start drawing our passage chart. We can mark on the departure and arrival waypoints, and perhaps some of the major ports and harbours in between. Then we study the passage information in the almanac and the large-scale chart for each of the major headlands. We can see that a ledge of shallow water runs southwest from St. Albans Head, and the almanac tells us that sometimes a vicious race forms over St. Albans Ledge, but that, in settled weather and at neaps, it may be barely imperceptible and can be safely crossed. We are advised that it can be avoided either by passing to seaward of a waypoint or by staying very close inshore. So we'll make a note of the potential danger on our passage plan. If we then go on to examine the seas off Portland Bill, we can see many overfalls on the chart, and the almanac gives us a stern warning that south of the Bill lies Portland Race, in which severe and very dangerous seas can occur, and that even in settled weather it should be carefully avoided by small craft. We're advised that we can avoid it by passing 3 to 5 miles to seaward of the Bill. Again, we make a note of the danger on our chart. Finally, a close examination of the waters off Start Point shows a relatively small area of overfalls south and east of the point. However, the almanac doesn't provide any information, so we might assume that, whilst they might make for an uncomfortable sail in wind against tide situations, there's no particular danger. If we were to draw a rumline course from Needles Fairway to a waypoint just south of Start Point, we'd see that it doesn't quite keep us clear of the potential overfalls off St. Albans Head, and passes only just 3 miles south of Portland. So a better plan might be to position a waypoint well off Portland, which keeps us clear of all the areas of concern. The difference in overall distance is tiny. Our total rumline distance is now around 105 miles, and we need to consider tidal streams and how long the passage will take. Obviously, there's a big difference between sailing the rumline downwind in a good breeze and sailing upwind in light airs, and of course you need to know your boat. If we take a 35-foot cruising yacht sailing downwind in force 5, then she'll make at least 6 knots, and we're going to use this figure in our plan. It's 34 miles from Needles Fairway to our waypoint south of Portland Bill, so in the absence of tide it would take us just less than 6 hours to get there. But if we plan our passage to make best use of tidal streams, we can get there much quicker. Let's assume it's springs. A quick look at a tidal atlas for the central English Channel tells us that the tide sets west for about 6 hours from the time of high water Dover. We've got to get from Lymington to Needles Fairway before we start on our passage proper, and we're going to want to head down the Needles Channel either on slack water or on a fair tide. So let's assume we plan to be at Needles Fairway at high water Dover plus 1 hour, then at springs, when we'll have 1.6 knots in our favour, then 2.1, then 2.2, then maybe 2.5, and 1.1 knots before the tide turns foul at high water Dover plus 5 hours 30 minutes. By the way, extracting the drift from the tidal atlas is not an exact science, as the arrows are quite widely spaced, but these numbers are fine for planning purposes. Of course, if today's tidal range isn't exactly the mean spring or neap range, you're going to have to interpolate the drift, which adds quite a lot of work. This means that over the next 4.5 hours you're going to cover 27 miles on the log, plus around another 9 miles because of the tide, a total of 36 miles over the ground, so we can make it to our waypoint off Portland before the tide turns foul. We've then got another 50 miles to Start Point and a foul tide. Now we have to move on to the tidal atlas for the Western Channel, and, as you can see, tides west of Portland across Lyme Bay are relatively weak. At high water Dover plus 6 hours, the tide will be setting against us at around 0.5 knots, then around 1.3 knots, 1.4, 1, and 0.8 knots before slack water at high water Dover minus 1, after which it turns in our favour again. This means that in the next 6 hours at 6 knots, we will make 36 miles on the log, minus 5 miles equals 31 miles, leaving us still 19 miles short of Start Point and 40 miles short of Plymouth approaches. In the absence of any tide, and at 6 knots, it would therefore take us around 7 hours to reach Plymouth approaches. So let's take a look at the tides over the next 7 hours. You can see that they are mainly in our favour, but the net is just +1. So at 6 knots we're going to reach Plymouth approaches in just under 7 hours at high water Dover +6. So, assuming we can make 6 knots, and by making the best use of tidal streams we can reckon to sail from Needles Fairway to Plymouth approaches in around 17 to 18 hours. But as they say, the best laid plans. What if there's substantially less wind than forecast, right from the outset? Well, as we've just seen, we can only make it to our waypoint off Portland Bill before the tide turns if we can sail at 6 knots. Imagine then if we can make only 4. Even with the tide under us, this would leave us 8 miles short, and the tides off Portland will soon be running against us at 2 knots, making our speed over the ground just 2 knots. So you've got some choices to make. You could completely replan your passage, but I can tell you now it's going to take a lot longer. Right from the off, you could motor sail to maintain 6 knots. And this is where you'd need to be sure you've got plenty of diesel. Alternatively, you could motor just when the tide is against you. There are all sorts of possibilities, each requiring a slightly different passage plan. Or you could divert to Weymouth and wait out a tide. Let's assume you want to go for the latter. Well, Weymouth is a pretty good run ashore with plenty of pubs and restaurants. There are no tidal constraints, and the pilotage is straightforward. But if you check the almanac, you'll find that there is a gunnery range between St. Albans Head and Weymouth, and if it's live, you need to stay outside a given waypoint. The almanac gives details and tells you who to call to find out if they're firing. Actually, if you've been listening to Portland Coast Guard's 3-hourly routine maritime safety and weather information broadcasts, you should know already. So, if the Rangers are firing, you can't alter course towards Weymouth too soon. Neither do you want to leave it too late. So, mark a go, no-go point on your chart and make the decision before you get there. On the subject of diversions, or Plan Bs, or ports of refuge, once past Portland Bill, the almanac warns us that there's not a lot of choice as we cross Lyme Bay, and once we're in the middle of the bay, we're at least 25 miles from any harbour. So it would be a sound idea to check that everything is still go before it's too late to divert into Weymouth. Are you and your crew tired or feeling sick? Is everything still okay with the boat? Of course, with a passage of 18 hours, or possibly more, you're going to be sailing in the dark, and it's not a bad idea to mark the major lights that you'll pass on your passage plan. Here I've entered them as green stars, with their characteristics as they should appear as you approach them at the top of the sheet, and if they have a red sector, I've drawn it in. OK, so that gives you some idea what a passage plan should comprise. Now let's look at some more general passage planning issues. In our example, we assumed that we could sail the rhumb line between waypoints. But what if the wind is on the nose? It wouldn't matter if we were in a motor vessel, but if we're under sail, we're obviously going to need to make a number of tacks. Is there any advantage in making long or short tacks to our next waypoint? Well, as you can see from this animation, assuming both boats sail at the same angle to the wind, at the same speed, suffering the same amounts of leeway, then, ignoring the very small losses made by the vessel on the red track, attributable to the speed she'll lose in her tacks, it's not going to make a great deal of difference whether you make 2 or 8 tacks on your way to the waypoint. Now let's consider what might happen if there were a wind shift 3/4 of the way down the track, when the boat making short tacks would be at point A, and the boat making long tacks would be at point B. Now the boat at point B would be dead downwind of the waypoint, and the boat at point A would be able to sail directly there. Sometimes wind shifts are temporary. In fact, the wind direction continually changes direction, veering and backing by 10 to 20 degrees, especially if it's blowing from over the land, which introduces turbulence into the flow. Racing yachtsmen pay an awful lot of attention to this, and, contrary to what most non-racing sailors might expect, most races over any distance at all are won or lost on wind shifts rather than boat speed. Other wind shifts, such as those associated with a front moving over, on closing a shoreline, or if a sea breeze is likely, are predictable. And if you suspect that one is likely, it always pays to sail towards the shift. In this example, with the wind blowing directly from the waypoint, it doesn't matter whether you set off on port or starboard tack. But then imagine that the wind veers 20 degrees. The boat on starboard tack will be lifted, and the boat on port tack will be headed. If they both then tack, you can see that the boat that went off on port tack towards the shift has made a big gain. We touched on this in the lesson on meteorology, when we considered a passage west down the channel with a weather front coming through, and it pays to stay on the English side. If, on the other hand, you are uncertain which way the wind might shift, it pays to hedge your bets by staying close to the rhumb line, making relatively short tacks, and a good way to do this is to draw two clearing lines on the chart and stay between them. We looked at this in the lesson on electronic navigation. The other factor when beating to windward is the drastic negative impact it can have on your passage time. A vessel sailing free, by which we mean sailing in the rhumb line without the need to tack, at say 6 knots, will make 6 miles in every hour, plus or minus the tidal drift. However, the same vessel beating towards a waypoint dead upwind at 6 knots, at 45 degrees to the wind, suffering 5 degrees of leeway, will make only 3.6 knots towards the waypoint. The really bad news, however, is if the tide is also against you. Because a boat sailing the rhumb line at 6 knots with 2 knots of tide dead against her will progress towards the waypoint at 4 knots, whereas a vessel sailing at 50 degrees to the rhumb line will only progress at 1.6 knots, taking more than twice as long. As we saw in the lesson on tidal streams, it's not unusual for the tide to set at 2, 3, 4, up to 10 knots in some places, especially off headlands and in narrow channels. And it can prove impossible for a sailing vessel to make any progress. In fact, she might end up going backwards at a rate of knots. In the days of sail, this was a significant issue for a ship's master, and even today, if you're racing, and therefore unable to use your engine, and the tide turns against you, there's nothing for it but to get the anchor down and wait out the tide. As you learned in the lesson on course to steer, if you're sailing perpendicular, or roughly perpendicular, to a turning tidal stream, it's inefficient to try to offset your heading one way and then the other, in an attempt to keep on the rhumb line. The stronger the tide, and the slower your boat, the more so. But what about a course to steer on a long passage with a tidal stream that might turn one way and then the other and back again? For example, if we were sailing from the Needles to Cherbourg, a distance of around 60 miles, but unable to make an average of more than 4 knots. Clearly, in the absence of tide, it's going to take around 15 hours. The tides in this part of the English Channel run quite strong, and since tide runs for 6 hours in one direction and then the other, and so on a 15-hour passage you're going to suffer 3 hours of tidal stream one way. To work out how much to offset your course, use a tidal atlas in conjunction with a strip of paper which you divide up into however many hours you think the passage is going to take, 15 in this case. Lay it across each page of your tidal atlas in turn, and write the drift down using positive numbers for one direction and negative numbers for the other. Totaling them will give you the net tide over the predicted duration of your passage, and you can use this to calculate a course to steer. It's a lot of work, especially if you have to interpolate the drift. Requires a bit of judgment, as there won't always be an arrow exactly where you think you're going to be each hour, and is only really practical if the set turns to 180 degrees. But it's the best you can do at the planning stage. Once on your passage, you should really compare actual fixes taken from your GPS with the estimated position you would get from using the tidal set and drift you allowed for in your course to steer, and make necessary adjustments. But this is heavy-duty number crunching, which maybe only a race navigator would bother with. Otherwise, you might simply sail a course equal to the run line and reassess the situation as your destination draws near. However, in this example, crossing the channel to Cherbourg, it's easy to get caught with your trousers down by the very strong tides which run east-west off the Cotentin Peninsula. And many's the crew who've ended up downwind of the entrance to Cherbourg with 4 knots of adverse tide and missed a much-looked-forward-to dinner at the exquisite Café de Cherbourg. Clearly, this approach will only work if you can sail this course to steer without tacking. If the wind was southerly, you have a completely different navigational challenge. When should you sail on port tack, and when should you sail on starboard tack? If there were no tide, and we don't expect any change in wind direction, it really doesn't matter. But with a strong tide setting across the run line, the situation is actually quite complex. For starters, the tide modifies the wind speed and direction. Here, with 10 knots of wind blowing from the south and 3 knots of tide setting east, the wind felt by a vessel carried by the tide will be coming from 165 degrees at around 10.5 knots. If the boat can sail at 5 knots, at 45 degrees to the wind, plus 5 degrees of leeway, she can either make a speed and course over the ground of 8 knots on 106 degrees on starboard tack, or 4.2 knots at 179 degrees on port tack. And, as you can see from the diagram, the boat on port tack is making much better progress towards a waypoint dead upwind. As you learned in the lesson on electronic navigation, this progress is called VMG to waypoint, and the port tack boat's VMG to waypoint is more than double that of the starboard tack boat. So, if you're having to tack to a destination in a cross tide, it generally pays to sail with the tide on the leeward side of your boat, and the strategy is known as lee bowing the tide. I should really be charging you extra for all this knowledge. These are race-winning strategies. The places where the tide rushes past a headland or through a narrow channel are called tidal gates, and if they're pertinent to your passage, it's worth making careful note of when the tide will be fair, gate open, and foul, gate closed. We can easily add this information for passing Portland Bill to the passage plan we created earlier. Of course, in reality, you would probably mark times on your passage plan according to the clock, not the time of high water in Dover. However, the merit of the latter approach is that you can file the plan and reuse it another day. If you're going to be sailing through 2 or more tidal gates, a diagram like this can help you to compute the optimum time to sail. This one is based on a passage from Lymington to St. Peter Port in Guernsey, where you have to sail down the Needles Channel, cross the channel, and then down through the Alderney Race and Little Russell. We can see that at an average speed of 6 knots we can make the passage in 15 hours, or actually quite a bit less because of strong fair tides. Whereas if we can only make 4 knots, no matter when we set out, we're going to be punching the tide at some stage. Incidentally, the Alderney Race is somewhere you really don't want to be in any sort of wind against tide situation. So, if you expect the wind to be fresh from anywhere from the southeast through to the west, you could mark slack water, which occurs at about high water Dover minus 30 minutes on the same diagram. And as you can see, by making 6 knots, we arrived there bang on cue. Just in case you ever make this passage, it's worth knowing that Bray Harbour on the north coast of Alderney is a great place to wait out a tide, except when the wind has some north in it, when it is unspeakable. Just like tidal gates, it's possible that your passage might start or finish in a harbour that can only be accessed at certain states of the tide. Many along the Normandy coast are like this, and you could take exactly the same approach, marking when they are and are not accessible. Dielette is an excellent example. The entrance dries at 2 meters above chart datum, which, by the way, in France is mean low-water springs. So if your boat draws, say, 2 meters, you're going to need a minimum height of tide of 4 meters, plus a sensible safety margin, maybe 5 meters in all. Obviously, the exact times either side of high water, when the tide will rise and fall above and below 5 meters, will vary day by day. But typically, it's around 3 hours either side of local high water, which is 4.5 hours before high water Dover. So you can see that if Dielette is where you're bound, and you can make 6 knots, the best time to leave Lymington would be at around high water Dover plus 4 hours. Another great idea is to mark up the tidal atlas, so that you can read the tidal streams off at a glance. We need to cover choosing a safe and comfortable anchorage at some stage. Many are marked on large-scale charts and might be described in an almanac or pilot book. There's one in Jackson Bay. The key things to consider are holding, by which we mean what's your anchor going to be trying to dig into, wind direction, and swell. If an anchorage is marked on the chart, it's pretty likely the holding will be good. The almanac or a pilot book will tell you what the bottom is, in this case it's sand and broken shells. You can find all the abbreviations on pages 6 and 7 of your training almanac. Different types of anchor work best on different bottoms, and you'll find descriptions of their relative merits on page 110 of the Yachtmaster Course Handbook. For what it's worth, independent tests suggest that the Bruce-type anchor, in the bottom right of this picture, is the best all-round anchor, but not all boats can easily ship one. And if you ever need to anchor in kelp, which is long weed often found on a rocky bottom, the only solution might be a traditional fisherman's anchor, pictured in the top right. Obviously, an offshore wind is preferable to onshore, but remember that if your anchor drags, an offshore wind might blow you out to sea, while you slumber peacefully in your bunk. A deep alarm on your echo sounder is a possible defense if the tidal range is not too great. And not only do you need to consider the wind strength and direction now, but also how it might change whilst you're at anchor. Many's the skipper who's tucked into a warm bunk after one too many nightcaps, only to find a howling onshore gale driving his pride and joy up the beach in the early hours. You can expect to cover anchoring in more detail in your practical course. As regards passage plans and the weather, the key elements of the forecast are wind strength and direction, sea state, weather, as in rain, fog, etc., and visibility. How much wind is too much? It's not so much the wind strength that matters, but the size of the waves, and especially if there is any possibility of breaking waves, which are more likely to occur when wind and tide are in opposition, around headlands and over shoals and rocks. Of course, it depends on the type of boat, with length overall being about the most important consideration, how well prepared and maintained she is, and the experience and physical abilities of the crew. Only the skipper can judge this, and it's always the skipper's decision whether to put to sea and when to call it a day. Actually, a well-found yacht can usually handle more weather than her crew, who might be frightened, suffer extreme seasickness, fatigue, and possibly hypothermia in gale conditions. It's a bit like I said earlier on the subject of taking on more and more demanding passages. Build up to it gradually. An offshore passage in Force 6 can seem pretty tough for the inexperienced, and it's unsurprising that Force 7 is sometimes called a yachtsman's gale. But you're on this course because you're an aspiring yachtmaster, and no one can really expect to become one unless they've sailed offshore in Force 8 or more. Take a look at this video. Jean-Pierre Nicole is carrying his spinnaker single-handed in Force 8, and the waves are not exactly small. Whether rain matters is up to you and your crew, but visibility is crucial. Unless you are equipped with radar and, ideally these days, AIS, and have been trained to use them, and you've practiced a lot, do not go to sea if fog is forecast. Of course, if you're going international, you need to follow customs procedures, if you voyage in and out of the EU, and the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man are considered outside the EU for these purposes. So if you're sailing to Guernsey, for example, before you leave the UK, you must fill in and mail off Part 1 of Form C1331, which can be obtained from Revenue and Customs and some harbour masters and mariners. Then, before you arrive in Guernsey, you must fly a Q flag and, on arrival, report straight to the proper authority, which, in the case of St. Peter Port, is the Harbour Master's Office, and complete their customs form. It's pretty much the same on the way home. Fly your Q flag before you enter UK waters, 12 miles out, and when you berth, call the National Yacht Line on 0845 723 1110 to request permission to clear customs. They'll ask you some questions and tell you what to do. You then fill in the remaining part of C1331 and post it off. Full details are linked in from the Resources tab. Finally, it's a legal requirement for all vessels engaged on international voyages to keep a deck log. Some skippers just refer to it as the log, which is of course a little ambiguous, as that's also what we call the instrument that measures how far we have sailed through the water. Exactly what goes into the deck log is flexible, and of course you might expect the deck log of a supertanker or warship to contain more than that of a small leisure vessel. But as a minimum, it should contain date, time, heading, speed, log reading, weather conditions, and significant navigational events, such as a change of course. If you're navigating using a chart plotter, it's essential that you keep a hard copy record of your position at regular intervals. Ideally, you would plot fixes on a paper chart, but realistically not many navigators do, so you might put positions in the log at regular intervals. You might also record the sea state, fuel levels, engine on and off, engine readings such as temperature and oil pressure, when you put your navigation lights on, and, of course, you must log receipt of any distress message or signal. Well done! You've completed the lesson on passage planning. Now go on to complete exercise I.